This unit is a continued assessment of conflict over economic policies that develop irreconcilable differences between Americans and their British counterparts over political principles. These matters would plunge the colonies headlong into a war with England before the matter of independence was even decided. England's first effort to enforce the Declaratory Act and bind the colonies to new laws occurred the year after, in 1767. The passage of the Townshend Acts, so named after Charles Townshend, the British minister who proposed them, imposed a light import duty on glass, white lead, paper, paint, and most egregiously, tea. Was an indirect customs duty payable at American ports. What this means is that most colonists did not pay the tax directly, but merchants paid it when they brought goods into the colonies at ports like Boston. Colonists still denied Britain's right to tax them without representation, and so non-importation agreements were renewed against the items, including tea, that were being taxed. They were especially concerned not only with their rights to representation, but also the fact that this revenue was meant to pay for colonial governors. As you might recall from a previous unit, governors were paid out of the purse of colonial legislatures, and oftentimes legislators would use the power of the purse to twist the arm of the governors to abide by the will of the people. All in all, colonists took the light new tax less seriously than the Stamp Act. They found that they could still get around the law through smuggling, especially smuggling cheap tea. When England discovered that merchants were circumnavigating the law, they sent 2 large regiments of troops to Boston in 1768. The British occupation of the city of Boston created extreme tension between the colonists and the British Army. A clash erupted out of this tension, which became known as the Boston Massacre. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, a group of colonial protesters gathered in the town square and harassed a British patrol responsible for enforcing a new curfew. The crowd shouted taunts, threw snowballs, and threatened the soldiers with bricks and bats. In the melee, a soldier was hit over the head with a bat and discharged his weapon. The commanding officer of the unit, a Captain Preston, ordered the soldiers to open fire on the crowd. In the melee, Crispus Attucks, a mulatto and ringleader of the mob, was one of the first people of the American Revolution to die. While both sides shared some blame for the incident, Colonial seized on this moment and turned it into a piece of propaganda pointing towards the tyranny of the British Empire. While the soldiers that had shot at the crowd were put on trial, only 2 of them were found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. They were branded on the hand and returned to England. From this point forward, any officer accused of a crime in the colonies was sent back to England to stand trial. The image here was an engraving by Paul Revere and began circulating within 3 weeks of the events of March 1770, depicted not as a clash of brawlers, but armed soldiers taking aim at peaceful citizens. Other important pieces of information are also absent. For example, Crispus Attucks is nowhere to be seen. Revere wanted his print to convince viewers of the indisputable justice of the colonists, and having an African American in the image could have jeopardized how it was received from his audience. This painting, which was done much later in 1856, actually was put together by abolitionists who wanted to celebrate the influence of Crispus Attucks on the start of the revolutionary cause. Protests, violence, and vandalism continued through 1772. Eventually, Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties, mostly as a response to the non-importation agreements that the colonists had been following. But they did leave a tax on tea as a demonstration of their ability and commitment to the Declaratory Act, the resolution that they had the power to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The flames of discontent would continue. British officials also increased enforcement of the navigation laws. Out of frustration towards this renewed effort to crack down on smuggling, the Sons of Liberty looted and torched the Gaspee, a British Navy ship responsible for enforcing trade restrictions in the port of Warwick, Rhode Island. The British oftentimes blamed colonial leaders like Samuel Adams for inciting what they called trained mob violence. While today most people can think of Samuel Adams as a beer maker, brewing was only one of many different kinds of jobs that Samuel Adams had failed at in his pre-Revolutionary War life. A Boston businessman, Samuel Adams did not have the wealth or prestige of his cousin, John Adams. But what brought him to prominence during his lifetime was his role in organizing the Sons of Liberty and establishing the Committees of Correspondence in Massachusetts. The Committees of Correspondence were a propagandist organization whose network of writers and newspapers aimed to communicate problems with England throughout the colonies. Reports were often more propaganda than truth and aimed at angering the colonists. After one was organized in Boston in 1772, over 80 other towns set up similar organizations. They exchanged letters that kept alive opposition to British policy. Intercolonial correspondence committees were the next logical step. Virginia took the lead in this department in 1773. The 12 other colonies soon joined the effort. They played a key role in stimulating and disseminating sentiment in favor of united action. They evolved directly into the first American Congresses. Members from the Committees of Correspondence would bring up the call for the First Continental Congress. Samuel Adams, a second cousin of John Adams, contributed a potent pen and tongue to the American Revolution as a political agitator and organizer of rebellion. He was the leading spirit of hosting the Boston Tea Party. A failure in his brewing business, he was sent to Massachusetts to the First Continental Congress of 1774. He signed the Declaration of Independence and served in Congress until 1781. Another Adams, whose contributions to the American Revolution are underrepresented in history, are those of Abigail Adams. The wife of Revolutionary War leader and future President John Adams, she was a prominent patriot in her own right, oftentimes giving her husband advice and counsel. At one point, she wrote to her husband, "Do not forget the ladies, as they are considering the issues of the rights of all Englishmen." Tea again became a central issue of colonial protest in 1733. The powerful British East India Company was facing bankruptcy. It had 17 million pounds of unsold tea, and the British ministry decided to bail it out by awarding it a complete monopoly to the American tea business. In other words, it was illegal to purchase and sell any other empire's tea. Because of this, price of tea actually dropped in the colonies, but the colonists saw it as an attempt to trick them into accepting the tea taxes. Where in the past, colonists were able to get around laws such as this through smuggling, the British authorities' enforcement of the navigation laws left the colonists very little option other than to buy British tea. Mass demonstrations forced tea-bearing ships to return to England with their cargo. Only in Boston did a British official refuse to be manipulated. Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to budge. Hutchinson infuriated Boston's radicals when he ordered tea ships not to leave Boston until they had unloaded their cargoes. On December 16, 1773, about 100 Bostonians, loosely disguised as Indians, boarded a ship. They smashed open 342 chests of tea and dumped the contents into the harbor. This action became known as the Boston Tea Party. Part of the reason for destroying the tea was to ensure that people wouldn't be suckered into buying the cheap product and weakening the non-importation agreement. Reactions towards the Boston Tea Party varied. Sympathetic colonists applauded. Many referred to tea as a badge of slavery and joined the Bostonians by burning the hated leaves in solidarity. Governor Hutchinson, chastened and disgusted, retreated to Britain and was replaced by General Gage as the colonial governor. The British chose a perilous path that led only to reprisals, bitterness, and escalating conflict. Parliament placed measures in 1774 that brewed revolution. It passed a series of acts to chastise the colonies, especially in Boston. The acts were branded in the colonies as the Massacre of American Liberty, or the Intolerable Acts. Most drastic were the Port Acts. It closed the port until damages were paid. Other intolerable acts limited the rights traditionally practiced in Massachusetts. Restrictions were placed on town meetings. Unlike before, officials who killed colonists in the line of duty could now be sent to Britain for trial. A new quartering act was passed, giving local authorities the power to lodge soldiers anywhere, even in private homes. Coincidentally, Parliament was also tying up loose ends with its Canadian colonies. It guaranteed that Canadians could practice their Catholic religion. They also maintained the institutions in their colonial governments which they were used to. Unlike the American colonies, these colonies did not have representative assemblies or trial by jury. England extended Quebec's boundaries deep into the Ohio River. From the French viewpoint, Quebec Act was actually a reasonable and understandable measure. But from the American viewpoint, the act was poisonous. It set a dangerous precedent by denying jury trials and by allowing unrepresentative assemblies in the new territories. It alarmed land speculators that perhaps they would not be able to access the Ohio River Valley as they had previously thought. It also angered anti-Catholics by extending Catholic jurisdiction south into the region about the size of 13 colonies. This map demonstrates Quebec before and after 1774. You can see the new territory stretched deep into the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. Young Alexander Hamilton voiced the fear of many colonists when he warned that the Quebec Act of 1774 would introduce priestly tyranny into Canada, making that country another Spain or Portugal. "Does not your blood run cold?" he asked. "To think that an English Parliament should pass an act and establish arbitrary power and popery in such a country." As a response to these intolerable acts, Americans across the continent responded to the plight of Massachusetts. They sent food to the stricken city of Boston. Rice was shipped from as far away as South Carolina. Most memorable was the summoning of the First Continental Congress in 1774. It met in Philadelphia to redress the grievances of Massachusetts. This time, unlike the Albany Conference and the Stamp Act Congress, 12 of the 13 colonies, all but except Georgia, sent 55 men. Samuel Adams, John Adams, George Washington, and Patrick Henry all would attend this monumental meeting. The First Continental Congress took place over a period of 7 weeks in the fall of 1774 in the city of Philadelphia. While it was not a true Congress, as it did not have legislative power, it was more of a convention whose responsibility was to plan for intercolonial action. John Adams played a key role in this process. He became the voice of the disgruntled Massachusetts people. Together, the Assembly drew up what became known as the Declaration of Rights, a petition of solemn appeal to the British colonies, the King, and to the people of Great Britain. The most significant action of the First Continental Congress was the creation of the Association. It called for a complete boycott of all British goods. That means non-importation, no exportation to Britain, and no consumption of British goods. Delegates were not calling for independence. They sought merely to reconcile with England and receive their natural English rights and the repeal of offensive legislation. But the fatal drift towards war continued. When Parliament rejected Congress's petitions, muskets were gathered and militias began drilling openly. Violators of associations were tarred and feathered and continued to be abused by groups like the Sons of Liberty. In April 1775, the British commander of Boston sent troops to Lexington and Concord to seize stores of gunpowder that were being saved by the colonial militias. In this image, you can see a view of the town of Concord in 1775. Here, redcoats are drilling on the Concord Green, near where colonial militiamen would soon repel their advance on stores of rebel gunpowder and supplies. The British troops were also supposed to arrest ringleaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were reportedly staying somewhere in these villages outside of Boston. At Lexington, Minutemen refused to disperse. This map shows the march from Boston that the Redcoats took. You know the story of Paul Revere. Paul Revere stood on the shores of the Charleston Bay, looking at the Old North Church for a sign of whether the Redcoats would go down the neck of Boston by land or across the Charleston Harbor by sea. 1 lamp if by land, 2 if by sea. Actually, the British sent troops in both directions, but 2 lamps were hung because the Redcoats first were spotted crossing the Charleston Bay. You can see here that they met and marched on to Lexington, where a group of militia were gathered on a green. When they were told to disperse, they refused to do so, and the opening shots, or the shots heard round the world, initiated the Revolutionary War. Nobody knows who fired the first shots, but it is commonly referred to as the shot heard round the world. 8 colonials were killed in Lexington before the American militiamen retreated back to Concord. There they made a stand, shooting opportunistically from behind every rock, tree, and fence post. The colonial militias chased the retreating redcoats back to Boston. This victory was minor in the sense of military dominance. However, it energized many American colonials to answer the call of military service for the colonies. 20,000 volunteers from across the colonies swarmed to the improvised camps outside of Boston. American victory was still a distant dream. These improvised forces didn't even have a commanding officer. Britain now had a war on its hands.